Bismillah. This is actually a topic that was requested by a number of parents, specifically because of what's happening in the schools now. So I said, okay, well, we can do a presentation on this topic, and there is a good brother who I trust who has also spoken on this issue in addition to transgenderism, Ustad Mubin. Some of you might know him. MashaAllah, he has an excellent discussion on blogging theory. If you guys are blogging theology, right? The blogging theology, so if you guys are familiar with that, it's an excellent resource. I would suggest you guys check it out. His presentation on the subject I thought was wonderful. So today, inshallah, he'll be coming in after my presentation. So there are a number of aspects that are important to cover and to discuss when we talk about this issue of homosexuality. The first of them is what does their community look like? And I think that's something that's important. And what are some of the attitudes that we as Muslims have toward the gay community? So my focus is going to be today just on the gay and the lesbian. So the LGBT, I'm going to be focusing on the LGB, right? The T is going to be Mubin, inshallah. So this is just, again, just some numbers. The general population, when I looked up information, it was like 7.1% of the population, but that included the T. If you just have studies on the T by itself, you're talking like minus 1.6% from that 7.1, which ends up, it's approximately about 5% of the population. The way that they're portrayed in the media is significantly higher in number and in representation, but this seems to be the general trend and the actual number, and that's more representative of how many there are. The next statistic is actually quite shocking, even for myself, and I was pretty familiar with the content and the population, but amongst Gen Z, it gets closer to 20%. And that shift in attitude and that shift in mindset is something that's important also to keep in mind. A couple other things here. I got this from the FBI website, and this is just the hate crime statistics. Over here, if you include sexual orientation and gender identity, you're talking about maybe less than a third of the crimes are perpetuated toward that minority group, but still a vast majority of hate crimes are because of race, less so because of sexual orientation or gender orientation. Religious hate crimes are still in existence, and again, this is all religions, right? So this is all religions, all races. And even to these hate crimes, they are a spectrum of crimes, right? So this isn't physical abuse, right? It could be slander, it could be defamation, it could be graffiti, it could be in different forms. So these are just raw numbers, right? These are just raw numbers of crimes that were reported. Some other information that I think is important, if we organize them by category, these are where the biases are. So anti-black or anti-African American, you're looking at a vast majority of them are toward that. You have toward white, gay, Hispanic, and then over here you have anti-Islamic, right? So anti-Islamic and maybe anti-Arab, anti-Asian, it's a mix, right? So anti-Asian, you're talking about Far East, but you're also talking about from the subcontinent, so it's a little bit mixed, and it's kind of difficult to differentiate between the two. Some more information here. Who are the people who are actually perpetrating these crimes? And I think this is something that's important to keep in mind as well. And I promise there's a point that I'm trying to make when I get through all this statistical data. Inshallah, it will make sense to you once we get through it. So, but majority of these crimes, so you're talking about like 70% plus are by indigenous Americans, so either white or black American. The rest of them by the other races, and like I said, it's very minimal, it's very nominal, the number of people that actually perpetuate this. Some other things that are important to keep in mind, this is the United States in general. So if you look at like ranking of crimes in the United States, how does this look across the world? And then this is in Muslim countries. So in Muslim countries in general, and I think this is including a lot of the terrorist attacks, because most of the terrorist attacks happen against other Muslims, right? It's unfortunate, right? So, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. I mean, so 3 times less than average, 82%, 6 times less, 56%, 3 times more, right? Murders, 3 times more, like per 100,000 per capita. murders with firearms are less. Murders with firearms per million is less. There are more officers because many Muslim countries are also authoritarian police states. The number of prisoners are less. The rape rate is less. The robberies are also less. And total crimes in general are less. Why am I sharing all this information? What is the relationship here? That most of these hate crimes are not perpetuated by Muslims. Ahsant. I also had meetings with individuals who were leads and heads of the gay community, and this was one of the questions I had. Have you experienced direct hate speech or abuse, whether it be physical or otherwise, from the Muslim community? Is that one of your complaints? And what do you think they said? They said no, right? That's not a problem that they face. And again, this is something that's really important that I want all of us to keep in mind when we have these conversations and discussions. So when they talk about, well, you're inciting violence, this is hate speech, these are all these things, my question is, okay, if we assume what you're saying is correct, how does that actually play out? And according to the numbers, it doesn't, right? The numbers are not representative of that. Granted, getting religious data on abuse is far more challenging, and I understand that. Is it possible that some of those white and black Americans were Muslim? Yeah, but the percentages or the chance of that is pretty low, right? It's not that high. But again, I wanted to show this data. It's pretty representative of our attitude toward the gay community in general. In that, okay, we might not want to mix with you, but we also are not what? Violent toward you. And we're not abusive toward you. And again, this is something that's really important when we talk about tolerance and coexistence. These numbers are meant to be representative of that idea and an actual application of that. So what is the ruling on the homosexual? So the homosexual is the person. Homosexuality is the concept. On the homosexual, what is the ruling? It depends. And we'll get to why. And also on homosexuality, what is the ruling? It also depends, and we'll talk about why that is. And it's easy for us to throw like blanket statements on that because the thing is like, okay, well, as a concept, as an idea, is it Islamic? I think that's an easier question. No, it's not, and we have general agreement on that. As a concept, as an idea, it is fundamentally anti-Islamic. How does that, again, play out into the real world? This is something that's an important discussion to have. So there's a few ahadith that we have. There's a handful of ahadith that we have. We have in a set of ayat that talk about this issue. The first of them, مَنْ وَجَدْتُمُوا يَعْمَلْ عَمَلَ قَوْمِ لُوطٍ فَاقْتُلُوهُ الْفَاعِلُ الْمَفْعُولُ بِهِ. So whoever you find doing the actions of the people of Lot, yani Lut alayhi salam, both the actor and the receiver are to be given the death penalty. So these are the different places and different scholars that narrate this hadith. You have Imam Hakim in his Mustadrak. It is called the Mustadrak because he wanted to include in his hadith collection the hadith that Imam Bukhari and Muslim missed. Meaning that hadith to him is what? Sahih, right? So if he's saying that Imam Bukhari and Muslim missed this hadith, then for him he's like, okay, well this hadith should actually have been included in their collections. Liya al-Maqdisi, he has a book called Hadith Mukhtara. He says in his muqaddimah, in his introduction, that all of the hadith that I put in this are jiyad, yani that they're good, they're sound. And then you have Imam Nasa'i. Imam Nasa'i is known to be a well-known naqid. He is a hadith critic, and the hadith, again, that he includes in his collection are also taken to be as such. Abu Dawood, similar, if he doesn't make a comment on it, he also sees it to be sound. Imam Tirmidhi, he has actually some commentary on this hadith, which we'll get to and we'll talk about. Ibn Majah, Bayhaqi includes it in Sunnah, Daraqutni also. Imam Ahmad has it in his Musnad, you have Musnad Abi Ya'la, and Mushkil al-Athar, which is important as well, and we'll talk about why. So here, Imam Hakim, he said it's Sahih because it's in his book. Imam al-Tirmidhi, he is one of the few early scholars who actually has a commentary after some of the hadith that he mentions, and he says there's a difference of opinion on the capital punishment of the homosexual. He says that there are two opinions. One of them, they said that there is no difference if the person is married or not versus zina. right? So in the case of zina, there's a difference on how the punishment is to be carried out, right? Whether it is rajam or whether it is flogging, right? And in the case, and then you have Hassan, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, and Ata, and Abu Rabah, he saw it to be the same as zani, meaning that if he's married, then there's the death penalty. If he's not, he's to be flogged. This is the difference of opinion that you have. Imam al-Nasa'i, he doesn't actually see this to be a had, which is a prescribed punishment. He saw it to be ta'zir, which is discretionary punishment that is to be decided by the ruler. And lastly, Imam al-Tahawi, Mushkil al-Athar, again, the unique thing about that book is that if Imam al-Tahawi puts a hadith in the chapter heading, right? If he puts a hadith in the chapter heading and he'll say this hadith and this hadith, right? And how to reconcile them. If both of those hadith are in his chapter headings, as he mentions in his introduction, then to him that hadith is also sound. So you have a number of scholars here that are showing the soundness of this hadith. And then you have this ayah, these set of ayat that are very clear. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُمْ بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِنْ دُونِ النِّسَاءِ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ مُسْرِفُونَ مَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا أَخْرِجُوا مِنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ وَأَهْلَهُ إِلَّا امْرَأَتَهُ كَانَتْ مِنَ الْغَابِرِينَ وأمطرنا عليهم مطرا فانظر كيف كان عاقبة المجرمين. That we sent Lut and he said to his people, how can you practice this outrage? No one in the world has outdone you in this or has preceded you in this. You lust after men rather than women. You transgress all bounds. The only response his people gave was to say, drive them out of your town. These men want to keep themselves chaste. And we saved him and his kinsfolk. So him and his daughters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved them and he told them to leave, apart from his wife who stayed behind, and we showered upon the rest of them a rain of destruction. See the fate of the evildoers. So what are some of the benefits that we can take away from this particular verse? First, Lut alayhi salam, he was ordered to give da'wah to these people, these same people. Meaning that everyone and anyone is deserving of being called to Islam, and that everybody has a path to forgiveness and to tawbah. Secondly, we should teach our families about sexuality. And it has to be age appropriate, right? You don't want to be very explicit at younger age. But as they get older and as they age, it's important to give age appropriate content to our children. So when should we start having, like I said, not graphic, but when should we start having these discussions? Everybody's kind of shy. At puberty, okay? When they ask about it, I would say the moment they start talking, right? So the moment a child starts speaking, we should start introducing ideas of consent. What is a good touch? What is a bad touch? If someone touches you, make sure you come and tell me. And that's what I mean by that type of education. We make sure to introduce what is age appropriate at the appropriate age, and then we move up as it gets closer. So when they get closer to puberty, it's a good idea to talk to girls about their menstrual cycle. It's a good idea to talk about boys about their development and possible if they're going to have a wet dream. But again, there's a gradation that's there. The earlier that they are, what is appropriate to them? It is important to instill that confidence in our children. La samahullah, if somebody touches our child inappropriately, what would we want? We would want them to come and tell us. But if they're never told or they're never encouraged, how would they know to come and talk to us? And we have to establish that trust and that relationship and that encouragement for our children. Families can break over such issues, right? So over here we have the situation of Lut alayhi salam and his wife. It happens. And this is, again, this is something that has preceded us. Also, just because a person is family, it does not save them from punishment. And many times we feel or we think that, okay, well, this is my son, and knowledge in taqwa, it doesn't transfer through osmosis, right? These are things that we actually have to instill in our family. And this is something Lut alayhi salam, he was very keen on, right? He was keen on teaching his wife, he was keen on teaching his daughters, and this is something that's important and a huge lesson for us. And lastly, Allah destroyed nations because of specific sins, right? So what other nation was about to be destroyed? Because of sin. But Allah saved them. Yunus. And what were they doing? What was the sin that was muntashir, or that was prevalent amongst them? Is it too early? There's tea in the back for anybody who wants it. Yeah, right. They were playing with the scales, right? They were playing and they were playing with the weights and the scales. So is it possible Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishes certain groups or nations because of sin? Absolutely. And this is one of those sins. Is there a situation of disbelief here? Possibly, because they're making something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made haram into halal. But Allah knows best. I find that a bit of a stretch and a bit of conjecture. It makes more sense that it was because of the sin itself. So, do we account for nature versus nurture? Is that an important conversation for us as Muslims to have? Yes? So if somebody says, well, okay, well this is something natural, how can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punish something that is natural? I think it's too early, right? Or, yes, you're going to say something? Oh, ahsant, good. There are other things that are natural. Like what? Like attraction to the opposite gender, right? That is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has instilled, and that's natural. And it is possible that I love or I lust after someone who is not permitted for me. These are things that are natural. There are numbers. Are there people who are more prone to alcoholism? Right? A lot of later studies or recent studies about pedophilia, that there are some people who are naturally inclined to be pedophiles. So does it matter if these feelings are natural or genetic? No. I am accountable for what? My actions. I am accountable for what I do about those feelings. If I'm angry at someone, does it give me the right to now strike that person or to hit him or to curse him? No. But am I accountable for my anger? No. No, anger is a feeling. Anger, happiness, sadness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, pain. These are all gauges that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in our hearts. And these gauges, Allah gave them to us to help us with our relationships, or as warnings, or as precursors. But He didn't give us these tools so that we would act on them, right? He just gave them to help us make decisions, not to base our decisions off of them. Saying that, there was some data that I had about this, the nature versus nurture thing. So anywhere between 83% to 64% of the LGBT, and I'm sorry, I'm including the T here because this is what the data had included, they experience adverse childhood experience. So adverse childhood experience can be either sexual molestation or emotional abuse or physical abuse. So I'm sorry? So in the minority community, it's 83%, and in the larger community, it's 64%. And this was a survey of 60,000 people that they had done this on. The next one was a survey of 1,000 people, and they say that 46% of gay men experience sexual abuse as children, and 22% of women. So, again, I don't want to get into the debate on is it important or not. I think it's more important on how we act on those feelings. And there are people who have negative experiences in their life, right? We all have some kind of trauma. I was just talking to Ramiz before the talk about toxicity, amongst a lot of parents, and that's a type of abuse, right? It's a type of abuse and it's a type of trauma that we carry. But how long am I going to blame my parents for my faults, right? That's not fair. There has to come a point where I take accountability and I learn, because they did what they could, right? Our parents, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve and protect all of them, and those that have passed, may Allah have mercy on them. It's like they did what they could according to what knowledge that they had. I cannot continue going through life blaming them. That's not fair. I have to learn from those experiences, and I have to teach myself, okay, those things I didn't like, guess what? Don't do them. I had this conversation with my son, actually. So I was talking to Sad, and he's like, I was visiting my parents. He's like, what's going on? I was like, man, it's so difficult dealing with them. And he's like, why? And he's like, they're just difficult people. So he responded to me, and he's like, don't be like that. I was like, it was just so insightful, and I was like, SubhanAllah, you know what? You're absolutely 100% right. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve and protect them. So there are basically three categories of people I would say exist concerning this idea around homosexuality. There are those who will say it's okay, right? And then you'll have those who will say, okay, well, it's not okay. And then you'll have those who will engage in it, in homosexual acts. You'll have those that won't engage in it. And you'll have people who are tested with it, and you'll have people who aren't tested with it. How do we deal with all of these different situations? And again, that's an important conversation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tests people with different things. He tests them with wealth, right? He tests them with social status. He'll test them with political status, religion, and some people He might even test them with sexuality, whether that be hetero or homo. Why is this important to understand? Right? A lot of people, well, why are you talking about this? This is not something that's important, or this is not something that we should engage in. It's aib. How are we going to be effective if we don't understand? Right? If we want to be effective within the community and preventing individuals from falling into it, that's one aspect of it. And those individuals that suffer from it, if we want to call them to Islam, if I don't understand, how am I going to be an effective da'i? How am I going to be an effective caller? And again, that's an important conversation to have. Saying that, just because I understand, does it mean that everybody will be guided? No. Yeah. Send a message put a message in the EC, and Samir, I think he can control it remotely. Oh, yeah. Okay. And let them benefit. It's not necessary that we always succeed. And how do we know this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said to our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Innaka la tahdi man ahbabt." Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, you don't guide who you love. Right? And it's very purposeful in His use of the term love. Right? There are individuals that we love and there are individuals that we care for, but it's not necessary that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides them. But it's not even realistic to assume everybody's going to become Muslim. Right? That's not a realistic goal. My job as an individual is to do what? Is to continue calling and to continue being a good Muslim, to continue nurturing my relationships, to continue maintaining good relationships, right? This is what I'm supposed to do as a Muslim. So saying that, how can we deal with homosexuals if it's such a major sin? And this is now where we get to the crux of the problem that many of us might face and might deal with. Like, okay, well, my coworker is homosexual, or my classmate, my sibling, a parent. Right? We have to understand that we live in a dynamic community, and these things are happening. We're not living in a bubble where it's like, no, this doesn't affect us. It does. I probably should have shared statistics of the number of Muslims that actually suffer from this. But it is a problem, right? We are not immune from the larger society. And that's not a realistic expectation. So, saying that, we deal with people who lie, we deal with people who cheat, we deal with people who commit zina, we deal with people in all kinds, all throughout the spectrum. What makes that different? Right? That's a question that we need to ask. What is it that sets homosexuality apart from these other sins, that we refuse to deal with them? Well, homosexuality, we already established, is a major sin, for sure. But, and I don't mean to trivialize it. Like, I'm not saying, when we talk about alcohol or lying or backbiting, I guess a good question is okay, well, how do I organize those? Which one's worse and which one's better? Right? And I think that's a valid question. How do we grade major sins? And so some people, they might say, okay, does my personal disgust count? For example, if I hate the smell of alcohol, can I now make drinking alcohol a greater sin than lying? Can I personally do that? No. Saying that, homosexuality for many people is actually, it invokes a sense of disgust. There was a study that I think it was done in Psychology or Psychology Today. When a man sees two men kissing, do you guys know what psychological response is actually triggered? It's like seeing maggots. And they've done studies on this. It's the same psychological response that men have. So there is a sense of disgust that's there. But saying that, does that make it worse than others? And yet Allah knows best, right? Because there are certain sins, we have to understand that, with something like this, some people might say, oh, well, there's a punishment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said there. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam prescribed a punishment. Some people might say, okay, well, it's meant to be ta'zir. It's discretionary. It's not had. It's not a prescribed punishment. And some people, I would respond and say, okay, well, what about being disrespectful toward your parents? Is that Is that worse or is it better? It's not an easy conversation to have. And again, I'm not here to trivialize it. I think it's important for us to kind of put these things in perspective. And when we talk about kaba'ir, I feel that it's better to put kaba'ir in a cloud and kind of put them all together. There are some scholars who've actually listed them, right? Saying like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what's interesting, if you actually look historically, the list of kaba'ir not only begin to become listed, but they also, as the time continues, you guys know what else happens? The list gets long. The list gets longer too. And again, I'm not here to trivialize it in any way, but what are the major sins? Lying, stealing, murder, sodomy, right? If we're being very specific. Like, these are the things that these are kaba'ir. These are major sins. How do we qualify them? Well, leave them in a cloud. Stay away from all of them. These are not things that we should be engaging in. And even if I do put a list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like what benefit is that? How am I benefiting from that? So I think identifying the problem is the first step that we would all take, and I think there are different pathways to kind of engage and deal with this. The first of them, if I have someone who believes it's okay, they're like, yeah, it's fine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was wrong concerning this issue. That's kufr. That's disbelief. Somebody says like, no, Allah is wrong here. This is not applicable. Allah is love, right? In that situation, we'd say that this is actually disbelief. This is kufr. What if an individual believes it's a sin, but he acts on his urges? I'm sorry? Yeah, right? It's a major sin, right? He's fallen into a major sin. What about an individual who believes it's a sin, but he doesn't act on his urges? He's rewarded. This is similar to someone, for example, if they're offered alcohol and they say, no, I don't drink. What happens with that person? He's going to be rewarded. There's no doubt. You have two people. You have two people next to each other. Both of them are offered alcohol. Both of them say no. One person suffers from that problem. One person, it's a problem. The alcohol is a problem for them. The other person, they're actually revolted by it. Who gets more reward? Right, the one who actually has to do mujahada, right? The one who actually has to strive and to make effort. And it's the same thing here. It's the same thing here. Lastly, someone is ignorant. They don't know. They're new to Islam. In this situation, it depends, right? Does that person have an excuse? Do they not have an excuse? And again, that requires more investigation. So, what are some examples? And what type of relationships do we have? And what are some difficulties that we face? I would like to hear what are some challenges that you might face personally. And it doesn't have to be a personal story, right? It could be a story of a friend. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Okay, that's a good question. So the question was, all right, how do I talk about this? Right, like how do I actually express this idea? I actually said I was friends, I still am, with like a priest and a rabbi, and we sat down and we were having this discussion about homosexuality, and the rabbi was like, oh, well, the Torah is not actually talking about sodomy, it's talking about raping, so it's, being homosexual is fine. And the Christian was like, yeah, it's all love, it's all good. And they came to me and they were like, well, what do you think? I was like, it's a major sin. And they were like, yeah, but doesn't that invoke ideas of like hate and like the same stuff, right? And won't people like abuse others if you say that it's a sin and blah blah blah? I was like, you guys drink like fish, like you drink a lot of alcohol. And they're like, yeah, we do. And I was like, we're still friends. I was like, and guess what drinking alcohol is to me? I was like, it's a major sin. I was like, guess what? You don't believe in my God. You don't believe in my messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I'm able to tolerate that. I said, anything less than that is also a sin. And we showed the statistical data in the beginning. It's not actually playing out. And I'm not saying like Muslims don't abuse people from the gay community, right? I'm not saying that happens, but I'm saying if you look at it statistically, we're actually not their biggest problem. We tend to mind our business, right? So if we know that there's a gay pride parade going on, what are most of us going to do? We're going to avoid it. We're not going to go there, right? Or if we know that there's an event going on that's catering to them, we're like, okay, yeah, I'm good. Like we have an avoidance policy. The same way, if alcohol stores, like how many of us here have been to an ABC? How many of us here even know what a BABC is? Right? Allahu Akbar. Yeah, so you know what I mean? Oh, yeah, sah. They're alcohol stores, right? These are state-run alcohol stores. None of us has been in those spaces. You'd be like, well, actually, you're promoting hate against people who drink alcohol. No, that's ridiculous. That's silly. Just because I view something as having spiritual repercussions, it doesn't now dictate to me about that person, right? That has nothing to do with it. I'm more concerned with what? His belief. Right? That's my priority when I deal with anyone. If I remember I had a brother come to me, he's like, man, there's this brother, like, you know, we got him to stop smoking and stop eating pork or something like that. And I was like, who cares? Like, why does that matter? Like, why is that even a thing? I said, get him to believe in Allah. Like, that's what's important. Like, belief is what matters. It's not these individual actions. Because it's very possible that a person will come to Islam and Allah will what? Will forgive him. Even somebody who falls into major sin. And how do we know that? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says very clearly, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives everything except shirk. Plain and simple. So what if an individual actually suffers from same-sex attraction? What if we know someone who has this problem or has this issue? What can they do? So I think the first thing is removing the confusion. So what happens is, like, remember the percentage I showed you guys of like Gen Z, like 20% of them have fallen into this. Why do you think that number is so high? I'm sorry? Like exposure, so our kids are exposed to a lot of things, right? But why is this issue specifically problematic? Well, drinking alcohol is pretty normal, right? So I think that there is a level of understanding and tolerance with our children concerning that. Why this? Yes? Confusion. Yes? So what happens is that children, when they're very small, it's not strange, like, so when one of my kids was 3, like, they were like, yeah, I'm Spider-Man. When I'm like, yeah, you know what, you actually are. Go put in your web slingers and, you know what I mean, and go in the city and fight crime. The problem with children, and one of the reasons that a child's witness and testimony is not accepted, because his narrations aren't accepted, is because they're unable to tell they're not unable to differentiate between what? Not just right and wrong, even beyond that. Reality, ahsant. Right? They have no grasp on reality and fiction. There's no difference. And I remember one of the brothers says, okay, well, you know, what about rushd? You know, when they have that ability to actually differentiate. I was like, for me, it's pretty simple. He's like, what? I was like, if I ask my kid to go get me a glass of water and he doesn't get lost on the way back, then he's reached the age of rushd. Right? When I can comfortably give him an assignment or give her an assignment and they come back and they fulfill the assignment, right? Otherwise, what happens? They'll remember that they have to draw something, right? Or all of a sudden they become a pirate, like in the middle of the way, you know, going to the water. Like, they're just unable to differentiate between like reality and fiction, right? And you know what that is a prime time for? Confusion. Just imagine that my child said to me, I don't know how many of you know X-Men, but Colossus, he's this guy made out of metal. And my kid was like, I'm Colossus, watch Baba, and he stabs himself. And I'm like, yeah, you are Colossus. What would happen? Right? I'm not helping my child. When I reinforce that false narrative, all I have managed to do is confuse my child. And like I said, when an individual's at a stage when they're unable to differentiate between reality and fiction, the easiest thing to do is to confuse them. So, like I said, attraction is a spectrum. Now, is it possible that a man might be attracted to a particular man versus being attracted to men, does that make him and define him now as a homosexual? Right? And I'm sharing this, and like I said, I know it's an uncomfortable conversation, but we have to understand that attraction, it truly is a spectrum. And because it's a spectrum, it does not define who I am. The only things that are clear and that are defined are the fact that I'm a man, right? Or the fact that you're a woman. These are very clear. But when it comes to issues of attraction, you might have, do you have people who are, they don't have sexual desire? Right? They just don't, right? It's just not there. Or it's so low that it's almost negligible. Again, that is not meant to take away from that person. But for him, marrying in the madhab would be? It would be haram. But if he has the ability to perform, it would be mustahab, right? It would be recommended. It wouldn't be an obligation. So when you have the spectrum, it's important, again, to be very clear with our children. And the other thing is the confusion of terminologies, right? So there are certain terminologies now that have become confused. One of the major ones that cause this is the idea of marriage, right? So the term marriage, and I was having this conversation, they said, well, why is it not okay for gays to get married? I said, because marriage is a religious function. That's why. I said, just like you wouldn't enforce ideas of prayer upon me and how I view prayer, or you wouldn't enforce ideas of what a masjid is, the same way I will not, and even why are you getting married? Have a civil union, let something be recognized, that's fine. But marriage is a strictly religious function. And all we've managed to do is add to the confusion. And that has actually been the wedge that has allowed that community in to confuse a lot of our youth. We all are tested with different things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كل نفس ذائقة الموت ونبلوكم بالشر والخير فتنة وإلينا ترجعون. That Allah does not burden the soul with more than it can bear, and every soul is certain to taste death. We test you all through the bad and the good, and to us you will return. We're judged by our actions. All of you know this hadith, right? إنما الأعمال بالنيات, right? Every action is by intention, meaning that if a person is tested with these things, number one, it's important that there is no test that Allah gives me or gives you except what? Except I can handle it. Allah does not burden me except with something that I have the ability to handle. So I should know that if something's happening to me, I could have lost my job, I could have broken my leg. I could, like I could have some kind of break in a major relationship that I have. All of these things happen, right? And they might happen one after another. I should have confidence that what? That Allah knows my limits. And He knows that I'm able to bear this. Otherwise, if Allah gave me something that I couldn't bear, that would make Allah what? It would make Him a zalim. It would make Him oppressive. Wa hasha. And Allah is above that. Allah is merciful. And He knows what I can bear and what I can deal with. And this hadith of intention, why is it important? Because if I'm avoiding sin, and I'm actively working to do that, and I'm sincere, then Allah will also reward me. So avoiding a sin is a good deed. So if an individual, like we said, suffers from this, and they make extra effort to avoid it, that person's reward will be multiplied. Ultimately, we're not held accountable for our feelings. I can dislike someone, I can be happy with someone, I can be sad with someone, I can be attracted to someone. But accountability comes in the moment I act. If a person does suffer from this, it doesn't make you a bad person. Right? It doesn't make that person broken. It doesn't make that person a less of a person. Human beings all suffer from different things, and we all have different shortcomings. And it's important to keep these things in mind. SubhanAllah, I remember Saif giving a talk one time, I think it was after Salat al-Asr. You're like, turn to your neighbor and ask them for a dua. And in that gathering, there are people who had cancer, there are people who had just lost their job, there are people who had just lost a child. We just don't know what people are going through. People all suffer in different ways. And it's important to keep this idea of suffer and trauma in our minds when we talk about a lot of these issues. that we just don't know what else is going on, and it's not something that we should dismiss. So here, Yahya ibn Aktham al-Laythi, he was considered Qadi al-Qudat. You have some of the major muhaddithin actually narrate on him. I believe this piece of poetry is in Ibn Asakir, where it says, وَكُنَّا نُرَجِّي أَن نَرَى الْعَدْلَ ظَاهِرًا فَأَقَبْنَا بَعْدَ الرَّجَاءِ قُنُوتُ متى تصلح الدنيا ويصلح أهلها وقاضي قضاة المسلمين يلوطوا. So over here, the piece of poetry is, we hope to see justice apparent in the land, so would follow this hope by making qunut, by making dua. How is it possible to correct this world and its people if the judge of judges is gay? Why do I mention this story? This is not, there are a few things to keep in mind. Historically, and even today, in our societies, there is a tolerance, not acceptance, but a tolerance of homosexuality, as long as it is closeted. If a person is not advocating, if a person is not openly promoting, and even with Yahya al-Aktham, why did they say that? Why did this piece of poetry come around? Number one, there's a lot of people who were jealous of his position because he was Qadi al-Qudat, he was the head judge. The other problem that people had with him is like he saw the punishment for liwat to be ta'zir. So he saw the punishment for sodomy to actually be discretionary. And they said, oh look, he's going easy on homosexuals. So what did they start doing? They started accusing him. Naftarid. And even if we assume that this is something that he suffered from, rahimahullah, it's not something that he ever propagated. It's not something that he ever advocated for. It's not something he was ever open about. And again, there's a difference between tolerating something and accepting it. Also, historically, and even today, men who are effeminate, there is a tolerance for that, even if there is not something that is advocated for or is accepted. This goes back to the crime data that we talked about initially, that you don't have open abuse, of physical abuse of people because of this issue. But it's because it was pointed out, right? Because somebody said something about it, what does that mean? That is still not something that was not considered acceptable. This is personal support stories. I suggest you guys read some of them, right? So this is actually a blog that a brother who studies, who suffers from same-sex attraction, he has written about his experience. Yes, a Muslim. تفضل. Yeah, but they've gone into what state now? Advocacy. And that's where I said where we draw the line. And I was very clear, I hope, that as long as things are closeted, there is a tolerance. The moment somebody comes and start advocating, if somebody walked through the door right now and be like, hey, I think Muslims should make zina. Zina, you guys are wrong about it. You should have sexual freedom, and this is something that needs to be practiced. What are we going to do? We're going to be like, there's the door. There's the door. Please don't come back. But if somebody believed that and they came in and they never said anything, what are we going to do? Alcohol, lying, stealing. Someone says, hey, he comes to the masjid and be like, hey, you guys need to stop praying. Same thing. The moment an individual advocates for something that is antithetical to what we believe, that is where we show them the door. Tfadal. Yes, I agree. I agree. Sure. And why? Because of confusion. Mm-hmm. They are. So when you have people who are advocating for ideas that are anti-Islamic, what should our role as individuals and as a community be? Jazakallah khair. Right? If they don't see us and if we're not involved, there's no change that's going to happen. And the other thing is that's amazing on this issue. You know what? A lot of people agree with us. They're like, yeah, this stuff should not be taught to kids. So it's not like, not only do we not show up, but we're also quiet, and because we're not forthcoming, We have other people who could be forthcoming, but because they don't see anyone else speaking, guess what? They're quiet too. It's easy when, for us as individuals, when we see good and we see it moving, you know, we get FOMO. We're like, oh man, we need to sign on to that too. And things start snowballing. The problem with these issues is because they advocate so hard and they start using terms like homophobic and transphobic, right? The moment somebody says like, hey, you know, this is not good, or you're a homophobe, or you're a bigot, or you're a racist, you're this and that, blah, blah, blah. And how do we respond? We become defensive when we shouldn't, right? That's the first mistake we have. It's like, and the second, or we don't do anything and we just kind of quiet and back off. I don't know if you guys are familiar. There was this trans person on TikTok who was like talking about and having like personal conversations with children. And there was a British woman, Muslim, hijabi, who actually spoke up. And she's like, look at this groomer. This person is trying to take advantage of our children. And she was putting up like a lot of videos. You guys know what happened after a couple of weeks? She apologized. Why? She got bullied. She got bullied. So we have to learn how to be courageous. Right? They're very proud, and they're very courageous of what they believe and what they're doing. Yes? Why should we not be proud of who we are and what we believe? Yes? There is. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Sure. hmm So, hmm Sure. No, I understand and I agree with what you're saying 100%. Historically, and up till today, and in the future, will you always have actors who are against Islam? Yes? Would you agree? Historically and today, we've always had actors who have fought actively against the ideals of Islam, whether directly because they hate Islam or because they don't like those ideals or their financial benefit for them. What does Allah tell me about them and how to deal with them? He says, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. That there will always be actors in the background. There will always be actors who are working to bring you down. There will always be individuals who are working from the shadows. But because I can't see them, this is something that is ghaibi to me, right? It's unseen. So all my unseen affairs, who do I leave to? I leave them to Allah. The same way. If somebody, can I fear that somebody's going to do magic on me? Yeah. Or somebody has put the evil eye on me? Yeah, I can fear all these things. But even if the shaitan comes in front of me, can I pull out a gun and be like, hey, don't bother me? Is that a realistic way of dealing with it? No. All unseen things, whether they be from people or from the spiritual methods, I have to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah only wants me to do two things. He wants me to believe in Him and He wants me to do good. That's it. As long as I keep working, the problem is that we're not. That's the problem, akhi. The problem isn't them. The problem isn't George Soros and the funding and Zionism in America. That's not the problem. You know where the problem is? The problem is here. Yeah. Sure. Everybody is. No, the issue is, that's what I'm saying. The issue is us. Like, who from the community is actually active in advocating? It's like very few. And it's unfortunate that you even politicians now, they're like, man, I don't know how to deal with this issue. Why? Because the constituents aren't telling them what to do and how to navigate it. You guys familiar with Hamtramck, Michigan? Hamtramck? I don't know. It's like, it has too many consonants in a row, right? But there's a city, Hamtramck in Michigan, and it's like, what, 90% Muslim or something? It's like some ridiculous number. They just banned the pride flag in the city. They just banned it. They said no pride flags. All flags, okay, which is good. I mean, they banned all flags. They had more, they took control. And again, that they're not an exception. They're not. This is what happens when Muslims actually get on the ground and they actually start taking action, they start paying attention. You know what happens? Allah puts barakah in their works and their efforts. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, yeah. 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 Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Of the person. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct. Because because the thing is, as individuals, as Muslims, we have multiple identities, right? Like me, I'm a father, I'm an imam, I'm a Muslim, right? There are multiple roles that we play in our lives. What they've done is they've distilled everything into what? Into the sexual identity. I see and I understand what you're saying, but what should we do? Yeah, they've worked for 30 years. Well, Muslims have been working for 1400. Like what do we need to do? We need to work harder. That's always going to be my answer. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, 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 yeah. I, hmm mm, sure. Yeah. 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 hmm Yeah, yeah. Because superficially, there's nothing there, right? Yeah, there's no action. There's no action to judge. No, I completely agree. In this, like, I see what you're saying. I would have to see statistical data of children who've gone through a Muslim education of the topic and those who haven't, and seeing if there's a difference. And I know it's out there. Like I know, I'm sure FYI has done some of the work. Young Muslims, they have like a lot of survey data that they have available as well. So I think it's important for us to kind of explore that. Is like, number one, are such classes being held in our communities? Which is a very important question. And secondly, what is the effect on the youth that are coming to those classes? Like, are they walking away from those classes with a better understanding, or are they walking away with the same understanding that they had before the class? And then we can always criticize the content. Yeah. Yeah. hmm Sure. Sure. And we'll talk about some of those differences, inshallah. What reward is there for this person who has these feelings? Allah knows best. We don't know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards people accordingly to the things that they love. And is it possible that this person will receive some fulfillment, or will that person's heart change? It's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Politically, right? This is part of it, because there's politically, there's individually, right? As a community, how do we deal with it? And I think this is a staged approach on how we're actually supposed to engage. So how do we define when to work with these groups or institutions or organizations? It's important for us to kind of develop that metric on how do I decide that. So for example, if there's a gay organization or a trans organization and they say, hey, we want to open a soup kitchen with you. Has nothing to do with that. Is it a good idea or not? That requires conversation, right? It's not easy. It's like, oh, well, soup kitchen is something that's harmless. Will it open the door to a better relationship or tolerance? Yeah, what happened? Yeah, I'll give a very practical example. First Christian Church, we hold Jummah over there, for those of you that are aware. Sometimes we even rent out the space. The pastor is openly gay. So these relationships are already there, and they're already established. The question is, what kind of rubric can we come up with to help us judge and determine on where and what spaces we can work in? And I think this is where many of us fail, and this is where we failed probably in the last 8 years, I would say. Because what happened is they opened their arms, and what did we do? We ran into them, right? and this is a problem, right? This is an issue. And they'll say, okay, well the Prophet ﷺ, he talked about Hilf al-Fudul. For those of you that are familiar with Hilf al-Fudul, is basically the Quraysh got together and they promised, they said, we're going to stand up for the people who are oppressed, those individuals who are taken advantage of, those who are weak, we will stand up to them. And we promised that. The Prophet ﷺ said, had I been asked today, and this is after prophethood, he said, had I been asked today to take that same promise, covenant, pact, Jazakallah khair, right? Had I been there today, had I been asked to take part in that pact today, I would have taken part in it. And I say, okay, he's willing to work with pagans against some of these issues and some of these ideas. Well, does that not apply here? And I think that there are a number of questions we need to ask before we can actually determine on when and how that actually happens. So one of them is, will the community be able to differentiate between political and religious stances? And it's usually not the case. Will this increase our visibility and influence in the political sphere, right? Are we going to use that as a vehicle to get more recognition, right? It's a question. Also, will this alliance bring more friends or create more enemies? That's something that also we have to think about. Other things, will we have to make any fundamental compromises to support the alliance? How much of a formative voice? And this is something that's important. Not a voice, a formative voice. What does that mean? That means that if I'm part of this alliance, I can actually dictate on what we're going to do. Again, these are important questions that need to be asked. Is there more value in allying on issues or as a whole? Like, if I choose specific issues to ally with them on, does that make more sense? Or does it make sense for us to form a coalition and actually work together? Again, these questions I actually don't have the answer to. And this is something that requires a study of the past relationships that we've had and looking at the effect that they've actually had on the community. I would say very prematurely though, it's not a good idea. I don't think it's been successful. And again, this is just my premature look and analysis of that. Yes? So this is it, right? Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Here we work with Christians and Jews, and so could somebody come and say now, okay, well, Christianity is a fundamental part of a person's identity, right? And they say, I'm Christian. Does that now normalize Christianity? Hinduism. We work with Hindus. So we work with Christians, we don't work with Hindus. That's what I'm saying. It's not, I wish it was clear on where and how to do this. I think Omar Suleiman has a book, right? It's called like the 6 levels of alliancing or something. And I think Dawood Walid has a book. Yeah, Dawood Walid has a book on this subject too. But like I said, a lot of these ideas it's very conceptual with a lack of looking at data in the past and seeing how those relationships actually played out. So there are a number of things to think about, right? That anytime we have an alliance or anytime we work with someone, how does that play out and how does that look? And in a number of different ways. If it's something that's going to have a spiritual effect on the community, immediately we what? No, we deny it. We say, no, this is not something I don't care if we're getting money and social status and political power. It's not worth it. The most valuable thing to us is our belief. And it's not something that we're going to align on. And every time there's an issue that comes up in the political sphere, do I always have to take a stance? No. And even the Prophet ﷺ, he said what? He said, Man samata naja. Whoever is silent is successful. And I'm not saying that as a blanket rule that this is the case, but again, we are not required to speak in every single specific issue. Individually. So, yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. How many? Yeah. So Governor Youngkin changed some of the policies regarding like informing parents if a student doesn't identify with their gender, some privacy rules regarding the bathrooms and spaces. And one of the brothers had an idea, and I had requested like Saif, he's like, hey, I was like, hey, can you create a template where people can just put in their name and their email address as a thank you to the governor for some of the policies that he put in place that are actually in our favor. And he shared it in a group which has about 250 people. I know, I'm in the group, right? There's about 250 people in that group. 7 people sent the letter. So you want to talk about involvement? There's one example. Homosexuality is harmful, both spiritually and socially. Why? Spiritually, it's forbidden and is a major sin. And secondly, there is a punishment for it, whether you see that to be ta'zir, discretionary, or a had, something that is prescribed. Socially, what are some of the harms and some of the ills? Some of these statistics are very shocking. 67.5% of homosexual men have intestinal worms. Homosexuals are significantly more likely to have STDs. I think they're called STIs now, right? Infections instead of diseases. Homosexual men have a median of 16 partners in their lifetime. 27% of them have had over 30. They're more likely to be pedophiles. They're more likely to abuse their foster children. Saying that, do you guys know what the percentage of fostering is amongst the larger community, not the Muslim community? What percentage of people foster children? 1. What percentage of homosexuals foster children? 3. They're 3 times more likely to foster and adopt children than heterosexual couples are. 61% of bisexual women, 43% of lesbians are victims of partner abuse. Who is their partner? Another woman. Compared to 35% of heterosexual men. 42% of women in prison are lesbian or bisexual, even though they are less than 10% of the population. There's higher prevalence of depression, panic attacks, psychological distress than heterosexual men. In lesbians, there is more general anxiety disorder than heterosexual women. How do we deal with individuals? Those individuals who advocate, which is what we were talking about, like who are closeted and don't advocate, we deal with them the same way we would with any non-Muslim. And I know that this is difficult, right, because it's part of their identity. But you actually do have conservative homosexuals. I don't know if you guys are familiar. He's kind of gone off the scene now, but Milo Yiannopoulos, he was a very conservative homosexual. And he didn't bring it up to the forefront all the time. So even within the gay community, one of the issues that I have is that they present themselves as monolithic. You guys ever, there's a book by Douglas Murray, like vehemently anti-Muslim, by the way, but he has a book that's called Madness of Crowds. Excellent book, and he touches on these issues specifically. He even talks about the tension between the different communities. He talks about the tension between the lesbian and the gay community, between the bisexual and the gay and the lesbian community, how the transsexuals have added themselves into that community. So there are a number of conversations that happen in those spaces that he's willing to address with statistical data. Again, nonviolence, which is something that we regularly normally practice, and tolerance. So what does that mean? That we have normal business dealings with them. Hiring, if I have a business where I make bread, right, this is something that is not going to affect that. But does it make sense to hire him as a Quran teacher? No. Professionally, how we deal with individuals, again, and the reason for that is the same thing, right? You don't want a person who has access to an individual, to a vulnerable population. We don't give them that access, regardless. So in these spaces, it's easy to have dealings with these people. Like I said, neighbors, cousins, right, classmates. There are different spaces where we do have to deal with them, and it's important to keep that in mind. Can we be friends? And that's something that depends. If a person is abused because of this identity, it's important to sympathize with the abuse, right? Nobody should be abused. And I've heard horror stories of abuse in the gay community. Like really bad. Like sexual violation of people. Like, oh, you're gay? Okay. Taking plungers, brooms. Like, nobody is deserving of that. No one. And we, as a community, do not tolerate violence toward others. But at the same time, we're not sympathizing with the homosexuality. But that's hard, right? It's tough to separate the two. But it doesn't mean that we can't. But we have to learn how to compartmentalize these things. And if I will confuse these two, right? If I confuse it and I feel that one will lead to the other, then guess what? Friendship is a voluntary choice, and in this situation, I should what? I should remove myself. But if I'm able to compartmentalize, that's a very different situation. Like, what if he's an advocate? He's treated the same as any caller to sin. Somebody comes in here with a pride flag, there's a door. We are not here, we do not advocate for any of these things that are antithetical to our belief system. A personal friendly relationship, like we said, this is something that wouldn't be tolerated because this person will continuously berate you about his sexual identity. And that's something, again, that is not to be tolerated. If I'm unsure, I'm in a situation, I don't know where this person is, it's okay. Talk to someone to give guidance, right? Seek shura. وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Seek shura, and this is something that's always important to do. But with that, we'll close here, inshallah. If you guys do have any further questions, please feel free to email me or to set an appointment. We can sit down and talk. Tafadhal. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the... Yeah. If you look at the core of a lot of these things, whether it be homosexuality or transgenderism, the core of it is attack on the nuclear family. Right? The idea is to remove the family and the family identity. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us and our families. Any questions? Or actually, we'll save the questions. I'll let Mubin, he's here. Write your question down, inshallah, and then after Mubin is done, we'll come back to it. Oh, dua? Okay. Now, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. May He Azza wa Jal protect our families. Ameen. Without further ado, inshallah, or we'll take a 4-minute break or so, and then inshallah, so if anybody wants to get some tea, we can get some tea or whatever. If you registered for the program and you haven't paid or you want to pay cash, please, there's a donation box here. It's $5 a person. Jazakallah khair. Or you can register online. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. وَأَقُولُ قَوْلِي هَذَا وَأَسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ لِي وَلَكُمْ لِسَائِرِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ مِنْ كُلِّ ذَنبٍ وَخَطِيئَةٍ إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ.